I'll go to Mr. Johns for 6 minutes.
See all my colleagues. I hope you had a wonderful summer. It's nice to be on the back on the unceded lands of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin people, and I want to thank our guests for being here today and for your service. I also want to thank Ms. Vignola for putting forward this motion, which we strongly supported. We've seen the rising cost of living that many Canadians are struggling, to make ends meet. Food costs are going up. We've just seen 41-year high in inflation, 10.8% in food costs. Against this backdrop, sorry, I can't hear myself. If I could, it's understandable why many Canadians were concerned. They're not concerned; they're actually outraged when they hear about the in-flight catering expenses here on this trip for the Governor General's March 2022 visit and tour of the Middle East, and the shockingly high cost, the $218 a meal it's unacceptable. And I've had a number of constituents write to me today about this issue, and I really hope that we can get further transparency and some changes actually today. And so, maybe I'll start with you, Commander Kenny, and again, congratulations on your promotion. Really grateful again for your service. Maybe you can talk about, is a budget for in-flight catering expenses established in advance on trips on Airbus and Challenger flights? And if so, can you talk about what the budget was for the Governor General's March 22 tour of the Middle East?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We do not have a set budget for a specific flight. We were provided operations and maintenance funding throughout the year to cover VVIP travel, but we don't specifically have funds allocated for each flight.
Can you talk about what checks and balances are in place for when in-flight catering expenses are beyond the norm, or what's been budgeted? I guess I'm concerned that if information regarding the catering costs for this trip hadn't been made public because of an order paper questioned by Mr. Barrett, we wouldn't even be having this conversation about the appropriateness of these expenses or how to improve practices moving forward.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So right now, this is coordinated between the flight steward lead on the particular flight, working with Global Affairs Canada protocol to determine the menu set and actually do the catering. We are absolutely committed to changing this to make sure that it reflects the expectations of Canadians and those that we're serving on our flights. And I strongly believe that we will be able to further reduce costs as we move forward. Okay,
that's really good to hear. And my next question is actually, has there been a thorough review of the catering expenses from this trip? And maybe what areas have you identified where expenses could have been reduced, and if so, where were those possible savings and where were they identified?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So one of the savings that was identified is in terms of the contingency meals that are purchased for the flight, which is above and beyond the total number of people on the flight. So reducing that specifically is one of the savings that has been implemented. There is also certain locations that we know are much more expensive than others. Having said that we were told, working with Global Affairs Canada, exactly what locations we're going to, and I would allow my colleague to speak to why they would pick certain locations.
If the chair would allow, I'm happy to jump in and add a little bit of detail there on the question of selection of locations. Often when we are traveling as the guest to a host nation, will be dictated what airport we need to land in, and in consultation with public safety and other partners here in Ottawa, we and the Air Force, of course, we identify a flight routing, and there may be some limitations on countries in which or places in which we can land to refuel, for example. So that explains a little bit the limitations sometimes on which airports. But I think what's really important is our members of our teams have been working together since this episode, and we recognize that there are problematic elements of this process. And what we're trying to do now is instill a no-nonsense environment where if there are exorbitant costs, they need to be flagged. They need to be flagged at the appropriate moment so we can make alternate choices or forego things that might have been part of the standard operating elements that have always been included in packages. And we're happy to make those choices, and we look forward to being able to deliver cost savings.
I guess what I'm looking for is, what changes in practices have actually been implemented since March 2022, and to ensure that there's responsible stewardship of public funds and ways to improve accountability so that it doesn't require an order paper question, so that, you know, Canadians know what expenses are being done, what changes are being done, what is going to be moving forward, the transparency to Canadians to help them see that this isn't going to happen again.
Well, I would just mention again that we are identifying cost savings. One of the examples that the General gave was this idea of contingencies. And to help people understand, it's the standard operating procedure when you're on an international commercial flight is that you'd be given a choice between two meals, chicken or fish. Would you like chicken or fish? And ordering enough meals to make sure that you've got a balance of those and you allow that choice is an art. It's an art that the caterers and the steward work through in order to have a balance between service and overage or waste. As the General mentioned, the number of contingency meals that had been ordered in the past have been strictly reduced over the last few years. We've now decided, as one of the outcomes of the discussions that we've undertaken since this became clear to us, is to forego choice altogether. So on the recent trip to London, there were no choices, and that reduces the number that we have to order because everybody's eating the same. So that's one, obviously not dietary restrictions. We still, but we were able to identify those things in advance and make sure that we've got a robust system of checks and flags so that we're able to work together and avoid these exorbitant costs.
To Mr. Johns for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess just following that, I mean, $218, you know, average for a meal. Is there any meals that stood out that were like unexpected, that were in the hundreds of dollars? Or, I mean, I think moving forward, are you going to learn and decide like, well, this is outrageous, clearly. I'm not saying that you should eat KD, you know, but, you know, like, and I think it would be good for us to know what are our soldiers, what are the costs of the meals for our soldiers that are going overseas? Because as Ms. Vignola spelled out, like, I mean, these are the people putting their lives on the line. Yep. And, you know, we're spending this much money on a delegation. I guess, Ms. McIntyre, you can tell me about the objectives of the Governor General's trip and about what outcomes were achieved. I think that would be important for us to understand as well, given the cost of this trip.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much for the question, and I will give an overview, and then I'll ask my colleague, Mr. Wheeler, to add to this, as these are the objectives of the government. But in fact, in keeping with what Madame Vignola, excuse-moi, dit, la gouvernance.
In keeping with what Ms. Vignola said,
you know, one of the reasons we were going to this region, and one of the things that she did while she was there, was go and visit our troops in Kuwait and in Qatar, to accompany them, to see what they were doing, to offer them support, to recognize them. We were also going to these countries as a gesture of thanks to these countries who helped Canada evacuate Canadians from Afghanistan during the crisis. We were there to build relationships with people that support this very important part of our in our foreign policy. And these questions, you know, the costs were really shocking to all of us. We had eggs, we had omelets.
Okay, I do appreciate that. And I guess in terms of the menu options that were presented by the Royal Canadian Air Force, were any of them rejected by Global Affairs? And if so, what was the basis of rejecting the menus as presented? And did the selection of alternative options result in increased costs?
I think I could lead on that question to say that that there's always a back and forth between the flight steward and my team, looking at the options that have been put forward, and there may have been changes to some elements, but again, looking at redundancies, looking at variety during the trip. Are we going to have the same thing for breakfast twice in a row? Are we going to have different things? Are we having chicken, fish, pork? But the on the question of the importance of the trip, if you allow me, I would just add that not only was the visit to the troops and the high-level engagement with the senior leadership of those countries important to express Canada's thanks and appreciation for everything they've done for our military platform that we use in that region, but also would remind the committee that we were at a time reinforcing the importance of regional peace and security in the context of the crisis in Ukraine. There were important messages to be
And just to wrap, if you don't mind, Mr. Chair, just one comment. You know, $218 a meal is about the average cost of the Courtenay-Alberni food truck that goes out and feeds over 100 homeless people a night where I live. And I just want to make that sure that that's on record, because that's what we have to be thinking about.
Thank